Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Our guest today is Dr. Gopi Sundar, who heads the international ecological journal Waterbirds. He's also a scientist in the Cranes and Wetlands program at the Nature Conservation Foundation. He's currently based in Udaipur, although originally he's a Bangalore boy. Gopi has worked on waterbirds for over 3 decades, particularly in the Sarus cranes of Uttar Pradesh. In this episode, he will talk to us about waterbirds and how they adapt and coexist with humans. Welcome, Dr. Gopi Sundar, and thank you for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you, Shobha. Pleasure to be here.
So your recent work turns public ideas about how waterbirds adapt to unprotected wetlands upside down. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's very hopeful and it's very surprising.
Yes. So I started off as a Bangalore boy, as you said. So a lot of my early experiences were in the Western Ghat forests. So it's a little bit ironic that most of my professional life has been spent in cities, has been spent in rice fields, has been spent in sugarcane areas, not areas where we look for wildlife. But looking has been extremely enriching, because what we've seen is that a lot of the patterns that global patterns talk about, we are not seeing those patterns in India. And that really begs the larger question of not just why, but are these patterns that we are now beginning to see in India, are they replicable elsewhere if we tweak some things in the environment, given the bad status that we currently have of how the globe is tended towards accelerating the extinction process. So what we are finding out are a couple of different things. One is, if you look at it in terms of the entire species assemblage that's found in an area, what we call a species richness or species diversity. So when you look at species richness, the current existing textbook theory is that any area that has a lot of human presence any which way is greatly disturbing, and disturbance is not good for birds. And there is also this theory that as human presence has been present for a longer period of time, you should find lesser species. So these sort of broad patterns are brought about, are supposed to exist both in agricultural areas and also in cities, because cities are, of course, full of human beings and bustling. So we explored this in two of the sort of extreme areas, if you will, for agriculture and for cities. And in agriculture, we looked at Uttar Pradesh, which is the most populous state in India, and is also the oldest agricultural landscape in the world. It is thought that formal cultivation in the world began in the Gangetic floodplain, and it's thought that rice cultivation began in that area. And there are lots of fossil findings and archaeological findings that support this. So we really went in to try and figure out, I went in to figure out as part of my PhD, and then I've continued the work since then to see if that's true, to see whether we would find very, very small number of species. And what we found was completely surprising. Despite being one of the most populated agricultural landscapes, and also one of the very simple landscapes where very little trees are found, very little what we call as bird habitats are found. If you look at wetlands, for example, wetlands are less than 1% of Uttar Pradesh's land surface area. That's a very tiny amount for a Gangetic floodplains. And in that area, we found more than 450 species using agricultural areas. We didn't enter any forest, we didn't enter any protected area. And that makes Uttar Pradesh a world record now for having the highest bird diversity of any very heavily converted agricultural landscape. There's a lot of reasons for this. But to talk about species diversity, what we discovered with a student in Delhi, Prakhar did his master's work in Delhi looking at ponds. And ponds are wetlands that are less than 5 hectares and are amongst the most ignored ecosystems in the world, because we think anything that is very small is not very good. That's the conventional thinking. And if they are found in cities, then they are even less good. So we wanted to look at ponds to see if that's indeed true. We should see a double whammy. We should see very few species. We should see species that are only adjustable to human disturbance and garbage and all of the things that come into a big city, especially a mega city like Delhi. And again, we did a systematic sampling. We went to 39 ponds and we looked at all of the birds. And again, the results were very surprising. We found over 120 species of birds in just 39 ponds. And just these ponds looks like they're about 0.5% of Delhi's land area. And they're supporting over 30% of all birds ever seen in Delhi for the last 40 years. Mm. That is a massive number that we cannot ignore. How is it that such small areas, we never paid attention to these areas, and they have such a huge amount of diversity of life? To be fair, both Uttar Pradesh and the wetlands of Uttar Pradesh, the agricultural areas of Uttar Pradesh, and also the ponds of Delhi, they mostly had species that were very small in abundances, meaning the individual species, the numbers were pretty low. So that was definitely one characteristic that stood out in both the places. But the numbers of species certainly defied all logic. It defined all patterns that are being seen across the world today. So it looks like, at least for India, if the farmers work in a certain way, and if you don't have hunting like you have in California or in Vietnam or in places like that where hunting is very common, either culturally or for sport, then you don't see birds on the landscape. And when that is not there, it doesn't seem to matter how many human beings are there and how long they've been there. It seems like that place will be full of birds.
So is this just birds having no choice but to adapt, or is it something else? What are the reasons for this?
So if it was a choice issue, Shobha, then we shouldn't have seen so many species. We should have seen a few areas or maybe a few undisturbed areas with a lot of species. And we should have seen that the other areas don't have. We're not seeing that. We are seeing some species that are found quite extensively across the entire Gangetic floodplain, for example. In fact, the world's largest population of the tallest flying bird, the Sarus crane, is found in Uttar Pradesh's farmlands. And that completely defies any logic that you can think of. And Sarus is a territorial species, meaning that a breeding pair will defend a territory, a patch that it calls its own. And real estate is very serious business in cranes, so they really fight for it. And so if in places that have very high densities of cranes, those areas are supposed to be healthy wetlands, if you look at literature. And if you go to Uttar Pradesh and see which is the healthiest area, it is places like Etawah, places like Mainpuri, places like Raebareli, not really places that comes to your mind as a Sarus habitat or as a large waterbird habitat. So there's something else going on there that we cannot talk about, that we cannot yet talk about. We have a lot of gut feeling and other things, but as I told you, our gut feelings regarding these areas turned out to be wrong. So really, we should move away from gut feeling and we should stop assuming things when it comes to India, because it looks like some of the countries, especially India, places like Uganda, places like the northeastern parts of Australia, these places seem to be defying logic. And so we should try and move away from assumptions, definitely go in developing a study based on your gut instinct, but look at the information a little bit carefully, a little bit objectively, and do proper analysis before you start to say things like ponds are not good or urban ponds are not very useful for wetlands, because that is not true at all, at least in India.
So am I correct in assuming that this is a hopeful study? What you're saying gives us hope that, and you seem to indicate that a certain type of human habitat, which is how human behaves in a certain habitat, is okay for birds. They somehow learn to live with us. So I know you don't like saying about gut feelings, but what are these people in Uttar Pradesh? How are they behaving beyond hunting? Are there any specific behaviors that invites the birds to coexist with them?
So there again, there are some things that make sense and some things that really defy logic. So it looks like who the human beings are really matter. And it seems like places like South Asia, places like Nepal, places like India, some places like Myanmar, people are just used to being with animals, it seems like. And this we call as culture, this we call as part of religion, call it what you will. We give it very broad, chunky denominations, simply partly because we don't understand it. And partly it kind of makes sense that we don't have a religion here, for example, like North America ended up with, where Christianity-based religions came in and they almost entirely wiped out the religions and the cultures that were there locally. Even now, if you go to areas with Native Americans in North America, or even in South America, like in places like Paraguay, if you go to tribal areas, you see a huge amount of birds. So it seems like, number one, if the native people of the land continue to exist and they are a certain kind of native people, it seems to be very, very good for birds. Now, this doesn't work in Thailand and Vietnam, because there, if you go to an area outside protected areas, you will hardly see any life at all, because people are poor and they really are striving to get nutrition, and any nutrition will work. Whereas in India, that's not the case. We are not necessarily a vegetarian population, because a recent survey showed that less than 25% of India is actually truly vegetarian. And most of us take some form of non-vegetarian food. It could be just eggs, it could be fish, it could be anything else. So vegetarianism alone does not explain what we are seeing in a place like India. So there is much deeper notions of culture, much deeper notions of our connectivity to the land, much deeper notions of what we believe is our sense of place, where a bird seems to matter, where it seems to matter that there are Sarus cranes in your field, where it seems to be okay if a whole bunch of nilgai come into the field and even damage the field. It seems to be okay for the farmer. Whereas in any other country, especially in a developed country, they would shoot the nilgai, they would shoot the langurs. It's not to say that farmers are not suffering. They are suffering from all of this damage, But somehow we seem not to completely exterminate the species that are around us, even if those species are damaging to us. And that we cannot really explain in terms of what it is that is causing this. And it requires a lot more people who are much smarter than I to figure out what's going on. But what we are also seeing is that there's a lot of reversal of trends. So there's this whole theory of agricultural areas and biodiversity in the world, which says that if you have much larger land holdings, then that, if you think about it, a logical explanation is that such a farmer will have small spaces possible to leave aside for birds. So the notion has been that smallholder farmers, farmers that have less than 5 hectares of land or less than 2.5 hectares of land, places with smallholder farmers will not have any wildlife. That has been the traditional thing in literature. Uttar Pradesh defies that, because there the average land holding is less than half a hectare. So it is the smallest of the smallholders of the world, poorest of the poor, so who should actually be hunting a lot of things if you think about, logical explanations. But that's not what's happening. You're seeing a huge bunch of species there. And ironically, what we are seeing is it's probably the smallholder stuff that is helping retain the birds. For example, if you go to a place like the Midwest, where I did my PhD in Minnesota, there you have mechanized farming. And there in 2 or 3 days, almost the entire state's agriculture will be harvested because they do it in a mechanized way. Whereas in a place like Uttar Pradesh, it takes 2 to 3 months for the whole area to either be planted or harvested. So it seems like because of this smallholder position of the farmers, there's always a bit of individual decision making that the farmer decides. He might plant the same crop as the neighbor, but when he or she plants it seems to matter. And because there is this individual, possibility of individual choice, birds always have a little bit of something on the landscape to move into. So if this particular farmer is starting to plant in the fields because of the disturbance, the Sarus just moves away and goes to the neighbor's field. So small things like this seem to be really responsible and working over centuries. We are talking about centuries that the Sarus and the people have lived on this area. That seems to have really facilitated this kind of coexistence. And again, ironically, the Green Revolution seems to have really helped species like Sarus, where amount of rice and everything else, what we call as intensification of agriculture really increased as a consequence of Green Revolution, irrigation canals and all of that. And because it is in association with the kind of people of Uttar Pradesh are that they don't really hunt indiscriminately, and the kind of farming that is very, very, very high resolution, small intensity farming, the irrigation canals are actually helping. Now we are seeing that with climate change, as the rainfall patterns change, the canals are the ones that are now helping support Sarus cranes in dry years or in years when the rainfall falls only in 1 month and cranes are not able to breed because it floods their nests. There we are seeing that the cranes next to canals or in areas with canals are doing much better, because the canals are helping them sort of either relieve the drought conditions by giving them water or by alleviating the flooding conditions by taking away the water. So we have this incredible vast system of artificiality that's been introduced by humans that seems to be working at various levels for a large variety of species, especially even large species like Sarus cranes.
So let's go back and forth between the conservation and the romance of birding. There was a saying that I grew up hearing in Tamil where a marriage is supposed to be, my father used to say, a marriage is like a bullock cart, 2 bullock carts walking next to each other. You sort of give some and you take some. It seems to me what you describe about the farmers of Uttar Pradesh and the Sarus crane too, it's like a chakkumada, as we say, where 2 bullocks kind of walk next to each other. Which brings me the question about the cultural resonance of Sarus cranes. And I know through your blog, which we link to, about you've stood in rice fields and watched them, you've heard them call. Describe for those of us about these birds. Why are they so resonant for us?
So the Saruses are one of 15 crane species, so they're part of a very old clade, as we say, as the evolutionary biologists say, meaning they've been around for over 100 million years, 170 million years or something like that. So they've been here before the man that we know today has been around. And they've been here before perhaps India separated out from Africa, and they've just been around. And we found, people have found Sarus fossils in Europe where they don't exist anymore. So clearly they're part of a milieu that we are completely unfamiliar with. We don't know what the world was at that time. And it seems to be a species, fortunately, that seems to have adjusted well. And it seems to have traits, things like omnivory. So it eats both vegetarian food and non-vegetarian food. So in Uttar Pradesh, for example, the Saruses will eat practically everything that is cultivated. They will eat peas, they will dig out potatoes, they will eat rice and wheat. So anything that the farmer plants is fair game for the Sarus. And the Sarus will eat a whole bunch of other things that are helpful for the farmers. Like they'll eat a lot of rats every year, some snakes, reptiles, a whole bunch of insects that otherwise would be pests. So this omnivorous habit helps. And the Sarus is a very, very long-lived species. So in zoos, some of the cranes have lived to beyond 90 years. So that is like a human life. And they have developed behaviors that are known as synchronized behavior. So you have a male and a female working in conjunction whenever they do some behaviors. And you have the most famous one of them is the unison call, where both the birds call together. And if you're far away, you won't know it's two birds. You will think that it's one bird because they are completely synchronizing their call. And so the synchronous call of the Sarus cranes is very famous across UP. And in fact, some farmers like to have Sarus cranes in their fields because they say that the cranes call in the night if there is a nilgai or a cattle that comes in the field, and they go out and they're able to save their crops. So it's a very common call. And there were many instances when I was standing and watching the Saruses, farmers would come up to me and saying, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Watching the Sarus cranes." And they would say, "Nah, Saruses are common. You're doing something else. You're probably here to buy the land or something." Because for them, they can't think of a life without Sarus. So it's very odd for them to see people come here and watching the Sarus for days on end and years on end. And there were instances when after we did color banding of the Sarus, we put plastic colored bands to identify each individual birds. I actually had a boy who ran out on the road and stopped my motorbike and said, "Why haven't you put any bangles on my Sarus?" So he was very upset that his neighbor's Sarus had bangles and his didn't. And so they're very, very strongly connected to people there. And it's also a very common strategy, like in many areas in Africa, the Saruses are in culture where two boys would look at a pair of a Saruses and say, "So how would the wife of my friend be?" So if the Sarus continue feeding, then the wife will be diminutive and he will be in control. But if the Saruses stand up, then he says that the wife will be domineering. So they have very interesting cultural connotations to Sarus behaviors. And that has gone on to extend to names of the Sarus. There are lots of names across India and Rajasthan. They're called Hareda. In other places, they're called other things. So they really come from a place where people have been seeing them for a very long time. So in recent times, because of canals, the Saruses have been expanding into the deserts. And their loud call is a source of fear for people. They've never seen anything, a bird which is 6 foot high and something that's calling so loudly. So they're really scared of the bird. But they stay away. And because Rajasthanis generally don't like to hunt animals and wild animals and stuff, except for sport hunting by the Rajputs and things, they're pretty safe here, even though the farmers take a while to get used to them and things like that. So the Sarus's behavior of unison call and territoriality makes it very easy to study them, especially for lazy people like me, where I just have to figure out what the territories are, and then every year go and visit the territories, find out whether they've raised a chick or not. And we can develop very nice, very high quality stuff on population modeling and on figuring out how the cranes are doing. And so because the landscape of UP was not changing for ages, because farming was such an important component, the Sarus was doing pretty well. Today, of course, we're talking about large-scale development since the last 15 years. And outside forces are now, unfortunately, responsible for ousting Sarus crane pairs that have probably lived there for many years. And there must have been pairs before that lived in those territories for even longer periods of time. So the farmers themselves are never a problem to species like Sarus cranes. It's people outside. So it could be government, it could be developers, it could be other people who come in with plans of their own that don't connect to the land. And that then becomes a permanent problem for Saruses, because as you can imagine, if a breeding pair is evicted, a breeding pair that lives for 40, 50 years and produces 1 or 2 chicks every year, the damage to the population is pretty high.
Yeah.
So the biggest threat to the Sarus now is this disengaging with the culture. The developmental patterns that we currently have absolutely don't match any of the landscapes where the development is happening. And it is sort of a very neutral, very clinical kind of development, which is not going to do well either for the development. We've seen that now in recent times in the mountains when roads are being built, and we are seeing massive landslides because roads are not supposed to be there in those areas. So they're not being built with the landscape in mind. And similarly, Sarus cranes and species like the Sarus cranes, the black-necked storks, the ibises, all of them are perhaps a very good litmus test for us to see over long term who is actually sensible in terms of maintaining the landscape in a way that is beneficial to both human beings and to the birds that can live along with the human beings. And in this particular case, the Sarus is showing that the models of development that we are bringing in, we are not being sensible about it.
If we add other cranes or other water birds to our repertoire now, you've written about the behavior of these birds. So can you talk a little bit about what was the term you used? Bill fencing of the painted storks. Then we talked about, you just talked about the duetting of the Sarus cranes. Then you talked about, in one of your blogs, it's about the body language. Please touch upon other behaviors in these fascinating birds.
Sure. I mean, I'll just focus on the large water birds in this particular talk, because the smaller ones, I mean, there's a whole bunch of other people who are studying this, hopefully will talk to you. But the large water birds are fascinating because they do have things like what the Sarus does, long-term pair bonding, as we call it. It's probably not true, but it is something that keeps them alive, because the farmers strongly believe that this happens, that if one bird dies, then the other one, the partner, pines away and dies in grief. And that is a story that comes to us from the Ramayana onwards, and very deeply entrenched in the people of the northern floodplains where the Saruses occur. In real life, of course, there's very likely a lot of hanky-panky going on, because cranes are known to be pretty versatile with their habits. And what we've also seen is quite recently, we've discovered something which is unknown in the world of cranes, which is the concept of trios. They seem to be okay with adding a third bird to help them raise a chick. And so we're just starting to publish about that and write about that. And it's very exciting, because crane behavior was until recently thought to be inflexible, because most of the work was being done on American cranes and European cranes and stuff. It could be that tropical cranes where very little research attention has gone, and it could be that these are the ones that are a little bit more versatile. The other birds that we really like are storks, and of the storks, we've discovered a very exciting new behavior. It's called a new commensal behavior. A commensal behavior is when the habits of one species benefits another species, and nobody is really disadvantaged. And commensal relationships are usually thought to be of, in a rainforest, in a tropical rainforest system and stuff. But we discovered this in the farmlands of Haryana. So our field associates who are part of this study and who are co-authors with us on this study, they discovered while looking at woolly neck storks, stork species that we've been studying for the last 15 years, when the nests of the woolly neck storks were vacated, when the chicks left, they saw that an owl was taking over those nests. And it was no ordinary owl. It was one of the biggest owls in the world, the dusky eagle owl. It's a massive animal. And this is beside canals, on eucalyptus trees, on sesame trees, in the middle of a thriving, bustling agricultural area. This really surprised us. And we sort of told the people saying that we would love to, if you could add on observing the owls to your repertoire of work that you're already doing with us, we would love to have you as partners when we write it up and when we analyze it. And much to our surprise, it's a novel commensal relationship of a large raptor like a dusky eagle owl that seems to really prefer woolly neck stork nests over all of the other nests of other birds, because it's not unusual for owls to use the nest of other birds, but it's very unusual for one species of owl to preferentially use the nest of one particular species, even though there are other ibises, other eagles, other vultures, other birds there which also build very, very large nests that the owl could use. It very rarely uses those nests, but for some reason seems to like the woolly neck storks. And much to our surprise, the woolly neck storks have been living in this area using almost the same trees that we are seeing today since the 1700s. It's an ancient agricultural landscape, one of the oldest canal systems in the world. And because of the canals, people have been planting sesame and eucalyptus for a very long time, pre-Mughal era. And the Britishers and the Mughals who've written about it have talked to us about woolly neck storks nesting on sesame trees, exactly what's happening today. And so avoiding research outside of protected forest doesn't seem to be a very sensible thing to do in India, because we are seeing novel relationships between birds of very different kinds of birds. One is a nocturnal bird, a large raptor, and one is a large water bird. And they are commensally living together in one of the oldest farmlands of the world. So until we get out of our mind that we need a protected area to look at birds, I think we will not discover all of these very, very interesting and fascinating things that we are seeing. We also, for the first time, discovered that woolly neck storks are territorial, much like the Sarus. We didn't know that. And the other bird that we've been looking at quite a lot is the black-necked stork. The black-necked stork is a very aggressive carnivore. It can eat a duck. It can bash a duck to death with its beak, breaking every single bone over an hour or two, and then it swallows the duck whole. So it's quite a sight to see this bird hunting, and it's fortunately a very common, fairly common denizen of the rice fields of Uttar Pradesh. And this particular bird, it's one of the few storks in the world, one of the few water birds in the world where you can make out the male from the female. The male has very dark brown kajal, and the female has yellow around the eyes. So you can make out the adornment from very, very far away, and you can make out the male and the female. And fascinatingly, we found out that one of the biggest breeding success areas of a large stork like the black-necked stork was Uttar Pradesh. Initially, it was thought it would be areas like flooded areas like Florida's Everglades or Bharatpur or things like that. We discovered that blackneck storks, which require about 600 grams of food per bird per day, once the bird is almost ready to fly, they are able to have an incredible amount of fledging, meaning number of chicks that are coming out of the nests are very high, which is a very strong indicator of the health of the landscape. So previously, single nesting storks, because you have three kind of storks, some storks that nest in large colonies like the painted storks, and some that breed individually like the woolly neck stork and the black neck stork because they're territorial. So single nesting storks were not thought to have more than 3 chicks per nest. Very, very, very rarely 4. So we've realized that both the woolly neck stork and the black neck storks frequently have 4 chicks. Black neck storks frequently have 5. And we discovered one pair in Haryana that recently fledged 6 chicks in a nest. 6. Can you imagine how healthy that landscape is? So moving also away from just photographing a bird standing in a field and trying to observe what it's doing over slightly longer periods of time can be really fruitful in places like India. And it seems like it'll be full of very happy surprises. And of course, the behavior of the birds, which is using the same nest again and again, having a territory within which if you search, you'll be able to find the nest in the breeding season. So honing in on the behaviors of the birds is really turning out to be a very rewarding experience.
Okay, this is a off tangential question, but for people like me who are bird watchers and who have been inculcated by people like you and MB Krishna saying, don't just go there, photograph, watch, but I'm not going to have the long span that you have in terms of studying. So what are some tips you will give me for when I go into a landscape for, let's say, an hour or two? How should I observe?
So you can do 2 or 3 things, and there's not, it's not to say that you can't do long-term stuff like around your house, for example. You will have a lot of birds around your house.
Yeah.
Crows are very interesting, for example. Egrets are very interesting. Pond herons have not been studied in great detail, even though it's one of the commonest water birds in India. Most of the water birds in India, which are common, have just not been studied in India. So those are things that people like you can really contribute a lot to. Bangalore has these fantastic tank systems which have breeding water birds, and we have seen a very interesting set of things happening in Bangalore where species like glossy ibises have now come in and they're now increasing in populations. So you could track that quite easily with your weekend visits or even with your monthly visits over 10 years to a couple of tanks. You can easily track how many birds are nesting. So it's not very difficult to do these things if you really want to do it. You don't have to do it every day like people like me do it, but you can definitely do it weekly or monthly, or develop a sort of a disciplined regime if that is what interests you. Most people are, of course, now interested in checklisting and photography, which is, if that's what drives them, then that's what drives them. But for people who are interested in other things, there are a lot of things you could do immediately around your house. You could go and select 1 or 2, either a water body or a tree patch, depending on the bird of your interest, like if it's a hornbill or if it's a woodpecker. And with a little bit of observation, you can figure out where they are breeding, and you can start visiting them and making sure you're not disturbing them. You can start visiting them a little bit frequently, making a discipline out of it and start observing it. And I'm willing to bet that you don't really require a PhD degree to figure out fascinating new aspects of bird behavior and how birds are doing, especially in cities like Bangalore, which are very, very unusual cities in having citizens coming up and helping restore lakes. And now there's a huge amount of effort to conserve areas like Hesarghatta, which otherwise would have been destroyed for development. So places like Bangalore really can have people who don't really need to be formal scientists. They can be scientists of their own accord, and they can still do a lot.
But one thing you said, which resonates, is basically it means that I have to go to the same spot. Go repeated birding visits to the same location is important, A. Now, and B, suppose there are pond herons in Alsur Lake where I go, and purple swamp hens. They all seem to be just walking around and eating. And so I have to look deeper. I have to observe. I'm not sure what, but I guess it'll come to me when I keep observing it.
Also, if you are a person who likes nuance, and if you're a bird watcher, you like nuance because you want to see the differences in the species, and you're looking for very close, you're looking at the species closely to see differences in color. So obviously you're a person who likes nuance. And if you like nuance, expand your mind a little bit and ask questions that are of interest to you. So for example, if you're a wanderer like I am, I like to go to multiple places. So my questions are usually related to suit my needs. So you could, for example, Bangalore has this very interesting phenomena every monsoon where very small number of pond herons take on bright red coloring on their leg. We don't know why. We don't know. Maybe it's to do with food, maybe genetics. We don't know why, but we don't know the phenomena too much. So if you're a wanderer, then in the monsoon, go to all of the wetlands that are there in Bangalore. Keep account of how many of them have come into breeding plumage, and try and observe how many of them have the bright red legs as opposed to the usual yellow legs that the ponder hens get during the breeding season as part of the plumage. So you can expand your mind and ask questions that suit your behavior. You don't have to suit your behavior to the birds.
That's a good way to think about it. What you've researched Asian open bills and lesser adjutant stocks in Nepal. Can you talk about that study also, please? And
sure. So that was another surprise.
Yeah.
That was another surprise. When we started off as part of the stock ibis and spoonbill specialist group, we learned that the lesser adjutant is not doing well. And in Nepal, it was thought that the biggest threat was agriculture. And so in an area where we worked on the Sarus cranes, we realized there was a hell of a lot of lesser adjutants and many, many nests that we saw. So we invited a couple of students in Nepal to consider doing master's studies. And they did some really remarkable work, which have completely thrown the old ideas out of the window. What we realized was the world's largest breeding population of lesser adjutants is in the agricultural areas along with Sarus cranes in central Nepal. So we completely threw out the assumptions that were written up in old textbooks that agriculture was harming the birds. And since then, very recently also, some colleagues have been publishing in Nepal and doing some careful work across Nepal, in eastern Nepal and western Nepal. And guess what? Everywhere, the largest breeding populations of lesser adjutant that they have found are on trees in agricultural areas. So, and these trees are very interesting. These are trees that are planted or maintained because of human culture, not because of wildlife values, but because of human values. So these are trees like the peepal tree or the banyan tree, which people don't cut down in Nepal and India because we have holy beliefs about them. And those are the birds, and the birds really like those trees to rest in. The other set of trees in Nepal that they like are bombax or the silk cotton tree. And Nepal has this very unique set of very large scale agroforestry where they invite the farmers to grow these trees. And then after a while, they cut them down and sell them for matchsticks and paper. And this agroforestry forest has led to this incredible boom of lesser adjutant nesting across Nepal, wherever agroforestry has come in. So it probably wouldn't have had so many trees if the agroforestry hadn't been included and hadn't been involved, because otherwise they need to cut down trees to reduce shade for the rice and the wheat. So lesser adjutants was a massive surprise, and now we are really thrilled that human habits are actually helping them. And the way in which Nepali farmers plow their fields and the way in which they maintain their small wetlands and stuff seems to be identical to the farmers in the Gangetic floodplains across the border, which is not a surprise because the political border is an artificial one. And both of them are doing similar habits that they have learned over centuries. And those seem to be very nice to maintain a huge amount of food on the landscape. And one of the foods are snails, because there's a lot of rice farming. And one bird that really loves the snails is the Asian openbill. We also have the African opalbill in Africa, which also likes the snails. And wherever there is rice, we find that there are invasive snails that have come in, both African and also other invasive species that have come in. And that has done wonders for the Asian openbill, which is now one of the few large water birds that's expanding in its numbers, expanding in distribution. It's reached China, it's reached very high altitudes, and it's doing really well. With invasion of snails, we've also seen the assistance of this to a bird like the Asian openbills, and the Asian openbills lives in very large colonies. So we've discovered a few massive colonies of over 200, 300 nests in Nepal, and such nests also exist in India, of course. Both across the Gangetic floodplain and also in Bangalore and other places, Kokreballur and places around that have stocks. So it's quite fascinating to see how agriculture and the way that agriculture is being done in India helps provide, as you said, very hopeful counters to the global debate about whether agriculture is good or bad for wildlife. And of course, you will never see tigers starting to proliferate in a rice field. That's not going to happen. But it's not as if rice fields will be without wildlife.
Yeah. And I think the debate about agriculture is good or not good is over, isn't it? We just have to assume that agriculture is going to happen. And now, as you say, what kind of agriculture is helpful to wildlife is the debate. You wrote, there are two posts that I wanted to draw your attention to. One is you write about a bird swallowing a keelback snake, and it goes head first. Which one was the bird? Do you remember?
That was the woolly neck stork.
The woolly neck stork. And
so that photograph was taken in western Uttar Pradesh while I was driving by on the bike, and the bird was just standing beside the road. It's
Ah,
very difficult in other places in India to see that bird so close by because they have a very small flush distance, meaning the distance at which they flush. Because they're scared of humans. But places like Etawah, Mainpuri, Aligarh, Raebareli, a lot of places across Uttar Pradesh, birds just don't fly when human beings come close. They're so used to it. In fact, when I started to work on cranes, people warned me about not visiting Sarus crane nests to measure the eggs because they told me that the birds would abandon the nests. And that was based on studies done in Bharatpur and a couple of other places. But the first nest that I got in to the wetland, the Sarus crane stood up on the nest and attacked me. That bird hadn't read any of these books that the experts had written, and it had gotten so used to the people of Etawah and the people of Uttar Pradesh that they were going to defend their eggs no matter what. And people have died by getting too close to cranes, and there has been no avenging action on killing the birds and stuff. And that's how close people are to these things. So it's very common to find woolly neck storks picking up snakes, picking up black neck storks picking up birds in that landscape. It's quite an amazing landscape if you can stay safe of the human element.
no, but what you said about the development, it brought to mind that we used to have names for our landscape, like the coastal region had a name, the gentle slopes had a name. But now, as you say, the development it is detached from the landscape, and we have names like Casablanca or some Buckingham Gate or something. So one of your posts is about the body language of cranes. Again, for novice birders, what do they mean? What are the, so we know how the bird flaps its wings and flies. We know when it fluffs out that it's cold. So what are some codes that you have detected that you can tell us?
So cranes are quite amazing in that they have a repertoire. The numbers of behaviors that you have is a repertoire. And the crane repertoire across all 15 species of cranes is the biggest repertoire of any animal in the entire animal kingdom. So it's both vocal repertoire. So they have different calls. When they're flying, they have a flight call, which you can make out from very far away because the male gives one note and the female gives another note, so that they are communicating with each other, especially in areas where there is no hunting. And then you can immediately make out in an area where cranes are hunted because the cranes fly very quietly, because they know that they might get attacked and they might get this one. So they're very smart, and survival is means everything. And then apart from the calling behavior, they have non-vocal repertoires, which is fascinating in cranes because they have developed this because they're such large birds, and any physical fight will possibly almost 100% of the time result in very severe physical damage because birds have hollow bones. So any attacks that they do on each other is likely to create a very serious problem. So they have evolved this very elaborate, very extensive set of behaviors. And in the Sarus, the red skin on the head is used a lot in communicating to each other. So if you're watching cranes approaching each other and you have your binoculars, try and focus on the red skin, you will see the cranes expanding the red skin. So when they are alert or when they are angry or when they're irritated or when they're excited, they just expand it and the redness increases. So they're able to control that amount of color. And obviously the other cranes, because they're a crane, they're watching out. So if they have invaded into somebody's territory, they'll quietly walk away if they see the red expanding. And there's no physical interaction at all. And it's just the way in which they're walking. They have very exaggerated ways of walking. It makes them really cartoonish. And they look really funny when they are pretending that the other crane is not there. But they know full well that they've done a mistake. So it is like a naughty child saying, talking to the mother saying, who, me? Who, me? It's almost like that. And they have a whole bunch of behaviors called displacement preening, for example. So if a very nice behavior to observe is in places which have high density of cranes, if you manage to find the border territory of two pairs and you go and sit there in the morning, without any day being missed, the two cranes will appear. They will stand the border of the territories. One of them will give the unison call saying that, this is our area, don't come in. And while it's giving the unison call, the other pair will pretend to be preening. It's not really preening. It's not really cleaning its bill. Both of them have bent and they're just touching the bills to the feathers. And then when these guys finish calling, these two will start calling. And the first couple will then go to displacement preening. And they do this every morning just to tell each other saying, listen, this is the border. You don't come to my place. I won't come to yours. And so they have this elaborate vocal and visual behaviors. They have exaggerated walks, and the walks can be both to their partners to tell them that how strong they are, how big they are. And they can also be walks to tell the interloper or to tell other birds, other cranes that have come too close, saying, don't come, this area is taken and this is not for you. So they have a whole bunch of these behaviors, which as you watch them, you will start to learn more and more about them. And they get more and more excited when they get territorial or when they get close to the breeding season. The most famous thing about cranes is also their dance. It's a misnomer that the unison call or the duet is sometimes called a dance. It's not, it's just a unison call. Their dance is very elaborate. They pick up sticks, they throw it in the air, they whirl in the air, they jump, and they do this beautiful kissing of the bills in mid-flight sometimes. And so they have this fantastic, I've seen a pair of cranes dancing nonstop for 40 minutes. Wow. So they have this really elaborate stuff, and it's thought to help bring on the hormones in both the birds so that both the birds get ready for breeding. So
maybe
cranes are
all the humans
fantastic.
who have these hormonal issues, we should also imitate the cranes and do some crane dancing.
Both of us are from South India. We know the importance of dance and how it really calms the senses, how it makes you sensible. Maybe that's what we're missing.
Yeah, maybe
we need to get back to dance.
No, but Dr. Gopi, first, basic question: what are the similarities and differences between all the cranes, the storks, the ibises?
So the bill structure is very different. The ibises have a long down curved bill. The storks have a variety of bills. The Asian open bill, for example, because it feeds the snails, and as the name suggests, it has an open bill. It has a gap between the bill. And the other storks have very big bills depending on what they eat. The black-necked stork, for example, has one of the heaviest and the longest bills because it likes to catch and beat up ducks. And then you have bills of birds like the painted storks that catch fish, and they need to dig in marshy areas and in areas with vegetation. So they have fairly long bills so they can breathe, but still they can poke around. The storks and the ibises don't call too much. Especially the storks, they lose their calling ability when they become adults, and very few storks like the adjutants are able to have a bunch of calls during the breeding season. And they have a wide variety of calls. They will moo like a cow, they will chuck like a train, they'll do all kinds of really funny calls because they have very basic voice boxes. And the biggest caller, of course, the one with the most pronounced and the loudest of calls, is the cranes, which have almost like a multiple set of bagpipes inside them. And you can hear a crane call for over 1 kilometer away on a calm morning in the floodplains, which don't have any buildings in the way and stuff. So these are some of the differences. And also height-wise, the Sarus is the world's tallest flying bird, and the population in India is the biggest population, size-wise. And then you have storks which are slightly smaller. The black-necked stork is slightly smaller. The painted is smaller. Yet the open bill and the ibises are similar sized.
And flight-wise, do they stuck their necks in or legs in, those kind of things?
All of these birds that we're talking about, storks, ibises, and cranes, have their necks stretched outwards, not like the herons, which have their neck inwards. Okay. So they are very similar in that way, where both the leg and the neck are outstretched.
Okay. What are some of, oh yeah, let's talk about, so you were invited to co-chair the IUCN Storks, Ibis and Spoonbill Specialist Group. What is the reason for creating this group and what does it do?
So the IUCN, or the International Union for Conservation of Nature, has a whole bunch of specialist groups that they under the Species Survival Commission. And these groups were created with the idea of exchanging information at a time when there was no email, when there was no ability to pick up your smartphone and send WhatsApp, because we just didn't know how these groups of animals and plants and birds and fish were doing. So they created a whole bunch of specialist groups to invite people who had similar likings. So you have a shark specialist group, you have an orchid specialist group, you have a seagrass specialist group, a manatee specialist group, bear specialist group. So you have a whole bunch of specialist group created with the idea of exchanging information to bring out the most high quality information at that time for that group of birds or animals or plants. So the stork, ibis, and spoonbill specialist group was created quite a while ago because obviously these are very charismatic birds, very large birds. Some people like to see them, and also there have been very interesting global scale studies done by people who have traveled all around the world to see all of the species of storks. So these are people who have written books on storks, ibises, and spoonbills that really attracted the attention of people saying, hey, it looks like this is a group of birds which is very important because culturally it seems to be important, size-wise they're important, and very clearly they're important in wetlands that they're feed in because they are carnivorous, and they're probably very good flagship species to figure out how these habitats are doing. And so this group was created quite a while ago. In 2016, I was invited to join my colleague, Luis Santiago, who is the co-chair. And the group was not doing much at that particular time. We just had an Excel sheet. Some of the people on the Excel sheet were actually not alive. So when I joined, I created the website. I re-invited people from around the world. And I also founded an online publication where we wanted to have not just scientific information, but also observational stuff. If you go to a market in Africa and you see some birds being sold, it should be possible for you to get the information out. Otherwise, what happens in peer review is that everything has to be statistically based or models or 10 years of work, and only then it's possible for you to publish it. But we think that it's very important for everybody to contribute to global knowledge. And so we maintain our journal completely free. The people who submit papers don't have to pay, and we maintain all of the papers to be freely downloadable online. Because, being from a developing country, I know the challenges of finding good literature and finding good libraries, and they're very expensive online, and journals can be very expensive. So we want to move away from that notion of being far too serious about everything. Of course, we take serious notes. You will see that in the first 3 issues, we already have some very, very serious papers that people have submitted because they wanted to have it in our online publication. And then we also have one-off notes where my student in Udaipur saw potentially the first nest of woolly neck storks being built in the city. So we have observations like that as well, because otherwise, there's really no way of us to keep track of what's going on unless it's out there and it's searchable. So now with this group, it's about 60 plus species, depending on what kind of taxonomist you are. And also they've included the shoebill. I know you've spoken to my colleague who works on the shoebills in Uganda. So shoebills have now been included in the mandate of this group. We are unable to do much over the shoebill, but fortunately there are people who are doing very good work on it. So we don't need to do anything. So we also want to start to bring these people together in person. Hopefully post-COVID, we'll start to have the global stork, ibis, and spoonbill meetings. We'll start to have groups that are interested in individual species. Like we have a special issue on glossy ibises, because all of the glossy ibis experts came together and we brought out the first ever monograph of that species. And it's doing really well. It's a very common species, so people don't pay attention to that. But common species have one thing which is very good, which is they'll give you a lot of data if you work on it. So it is a wonderful species. It's a wonderful kind of species for you to work on. But of course, we also have a whole bunch of rare species that we really need to start working on. But fortunately, we have other groups who are also doing really exemplary work on black stork, especially a black stork working group in Europe is doing some incredible work on black storks. There are other colleagues who are working on the northern bald ibises in Europe and Africa. It's a very severely endangered species of ibis. So we, of course, don't have to do everything. But as a group, we try and provide a basis for people to communicate to each other, to have information out there which is easily accessible, and also sometimes to help start work, either through colleagues or through students or through projects with universities.
What was the bird in Australia that when I told you, let's talk about a non-Indian bird species, you mentioned one that I didn't know?
So that's one of the 15 species of cranes, the crane called the Brolga. So it's a crane that is found very, very similar looking to Sarus. The amount of red on the head is much less, and it has a wattle on the throat. So the Brolga is a crane that's found endemic to Australia and maybe a couple of countries around, because it does fly over the ocean and go to some of the islands. So Brolgas are quite fascinating. We know very little about them because they're a common species. And like everywhere else, common species don't get too much research attention because people are very busy looking at the endangered species. So when we did work on the Sarus cranes in Australia, we also collected a lot of data on Brolgas, because two such closely related species living together, especially when they're so big, is a matter of great interest, because in ecology, they're called sympatric species. And how do such closely related species that may have the same kind of requirements, how are they able to coexist? Do they fight all the time? Do they not? And so we were very interested in figuring out all of these things about the Brolga, because we had an opportunity to do so in the areas where Saruses are breeding. And so when we went in, we collected a lot of information of habitat use, and we also collected the feathers of both the species of birds. And using the feathers, my colleague Kate Brandis did some very interesting isotope analysis of the feathers, and she found out that Brolgas are able to coexist with Sarus at two levels. One, they use slightly different habitats. So the Saruses like eucalyptus forested grasslands there, completely different from their areas in India, which are open areas and rice fields. And the Brolgas like open grasslands. And Australia has plenty of open grasslands because very few cities and very few congested areas. So the most of the Brolgas we saw were in open areas, and most of the Sarus, or practically all of the Sarus we saw, were in the forested areas. And the isotopes showed up that they were actually feeding on different things. So they're able to adjust because they're getting along. They're literally getting along by figuring out what the other one is eating. I don't know how they figure out that I shouldn't eat this, but they seem to have just become gentlemanly, and they seem to be getting along. So some visitors in the area 20, 30 years ago had suggested that the Sarus might die out because the Brolga is very aggressive or something like that. And they had got some basic statistics of what the proportions of Sarus and Brolga are. 30 years later, we went and did in this exact same area, similar kind of studies, and we found the proportions haven't changed at all. So it looks like it is not species competition that's going to threaten a species like Sarus. And because of our surveys, we were also able to show that those areas in Australia have some of the highest breeding successes of any crane species, almost similar to India in many years. And in 1 or 2 years, they were record-breaking years. And they are the highest amount of breeding that any crane has seen anywhere in the world. And based on our work and based on our findings that these species are getting along, they're using a wide variety of habitats, they are found in a much larger area than we thought before, and that there are many, many more Brolgas and Saruses than we thought. The Sarus has now been reduced to a near threatened species in Australia. Otherwise, it was thought to be a threatened species, primarily because of lack of information. And the Brolgas now we are seeing, because of not work that I have done, but what other colleagues are doing, that they might actually be getting depleted in other parts of Australia where I'm not working. So a Brolga is a very interesting species, very similar to Saruses in that it seems to adjust to rice paddies in southeastern Australia. And there the farmers also, again, much like Indian farmers, really like the Brolgas. And they know that the Brolga is their bird because it's got an Aboriginal sounding name, and Aboriginals have a lot of stories about Brolgas. So that's an interesting bird that I have enjoyed working on outside of India.
So, dumb question. Is this the Indian Sarus that is migrating to Australia, or?
No. Saruses are found in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia.
Okay.
Yeah, and because it's such an old bird, it must have been part of one connected landscape. And after Australia broke away, India broke away, they broke into small bits. And people who have done genetics found out that there is a little bit of what we call as a clinal difference, meaning the birds in India are very similar, but slightly dissimilar from the birds in Southeast Asia. And the birds in Southeast Asia are similar internally, but slightly dissimilar from the ones in Australia, who are even less similar to the ones in India, but not enough to call them subspecies or species.
We always ask our guests this. What are some of your favorite species of birds?
Anything that is 4 foot and high and which is easy to identify, I love those birds. I really find it very difficult to try and identify all of these small birds, though it excites me quite a lot to try and figure out stuff. And also, I really like birds that are territorial and long-lived, because I've seen that you can really try and get under the skin of the bird. Of course, I know that there are many smaller birds because now that we moved to Udaipur, we've been seeing fantails and we've been seeing some of the other larks and other stuff. They're also obviously very territorial. So anything that displays territory or displays a behavior like this, which makes it easy for me to say, oh, this fellow is back in the territory, it really connects me with that bird, because you go to an area and you're looking around for that bird. So we know an area, for example, which has both the species of fantail flycatchers here. And we know that if you go to that area, you'll probably find one species on the left and one species on the right of the bridge, and they're usually there. So that's fun. It's really fun to get in.
You like a good brawl, it looks like, between.
They're not fighting. They're not fighting at all, but they're territorial. And so we know that we can expect to see them there. And
sorry, you've held these, I've seen photos of you holding these large birds. What do they feel like?
So the Sarus the adult male is about 12 kilos. So it's a pretty heavy bird if you think about it. But the wingspan is so big that even with 12 kilos, it can fly. So it's, unless you're very well trained, or unless somebody teaches you quite a lot, or you looked at videos, my suggestion would be not to try to handle a Sarus or anything, because they have pretty long beaks, and we've seen pretty severe damage to eyes and ears and other things if you don't handle the bird properly. What we've also done is putting bands on the birds. It's sort of the ultimate way to get to know the bird, because you know the individual without any ambiguity. So catching birds, while I sort of try to stay away from it because it disturbs the birds a lot, I do like the notion of catching them once, putting bands or putting transmitters, and then letting them go and then study them from far away. So it's a great experience to hold on to. I've had the distinct privilege of holding on to bustards, to cranes, to owls, to eagles, to a whole bunch of waders. So it's quite an amazing feeling to hold a bird. Of course, with the advent of the cell phone, now it gets very irritating to work in a crowd because everybody has their cell phones out for selfies and things like that. So I try not to work in a pack, even though I know the value of awareness and education and stuff of working with a group. But it's nothing quite like getting to know your bird by holding it.
So what do you have to do? You have to calm yourself down so that you calm the bird down. How do you?
You have to be very calm. You shouldn't be talking too much. And even if you're talking, speak in very low voices, especially with very large birds, which can kick, which can open their wings. You have to be very careful. There are some birds that become very docile. So bustards, for example, become surprisingly docile. They just don't move at all when you hold on to them. And there are several birds like this that just become completely docile. Raptors are not like that. Raptors will attack. Owls will try to get their claws around you, so you have to hold their feet very carefully. Their beaks are not very strong, owls, but eagles and other stuff, their beaks are very strong. So you have to have gloves, and some of the eagles, like the larger eagles, the golden eagles and stuff, I've held them only with a very heavy glove because they can take a chunk out of your skin.
So I want to end with one question. We've talked about cranes, and what are some fascinating species of cranes other than the Sarus that you can talk about?
So Asia has the highest diversity of cranes. It's got 7 species, which is quite spectacular. And you have species like, of course, the Siberian crane, which used to come to India. So imagine a bird that breeds in northern Russia and flies all the way down to India. That is simply spectacular. And it used to do it very quickly, not over months, but over a few days. And so these birds can really fly. So Siberian crane is one of my favorite cranes, actually, because it just got a very interesting call. But the cranes that really I'm attracted to is from a continent I've not yet been to. I've published work from there because I have students and other colleagues who work there, and I've advised them. But the cranes in Africa are something that really attract me. The blue cranes, the national bird of South Africa, is such a beautiful looking crane. It doesn't look like a crane at all. It looks like it's got a hooded head. It looks like a snake. And it's got a beautiful sort of flowing gown on its tail. And then there are 2 species of crowned cranes, the black crowned crane and the gray crowned crane, and their crown is simply spectacular. They're very, very specialized feathers, and they're golden yellow in color. And they probably use it to communicate quite a lot with each other. They probably use it to sort of gain a sense of how healthy the other individual is. Who knows what they use it for, but I really love those 2 cranes as well. The other one that I like quite a lot, simply because of the numbers, is a crane that I've experienced in North America, the sandhill cranes. I've been to the Platte River, which is thought to be one of the biggest congregations of cranes anywhere in the world. 500,000 cranes come together in one place, and the noise in...
Where is the Platte River? Where is it?
The Platte River is in the Midwest. And so they all aggregate before they start to migrate down south. And so the noise in the evening when they aggregate, when they are sleeping and they get together in the river, because they sleep in the river to avoid being predated. And the noise in the morning when they're all communicating with each other and fly away is something to be experienced. So the sandhill crane I quite like because of how common it is. And that commonness gives rise to spectacles like what you see in the Platte River, which is 500,000 birds in one in one place.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Gopi Sundar. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you very much, Shobha.
Okay.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for listening.